What is psychology? To understand the basis of perception, memory, creativity, fear, love, anxiety, addictions, and much, much more, psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior. But studying the intersection between the mind's inner experience with the outer expressions of behavior is never simple. The brain is one of the most complex known pieces of matter. Many basic ideas we still examine in psychology can be traced back to the theories of two Greek philosophers from the 4th century BC, Aristotle and Plato.
Even though their psychologies aren't a psychology you'd want to run today in psychological science, what you get out of the Greeks like Aristotle and Plato is a very logical, analytical form of psychology that treats behavior as something that isn't particularly mystical at all. You can analyze reasons for action, types of causes of an event.
Plato was what we call a nativist. He believed that certain kinds of knowledge are innate, whereas Aristotle believed that all knowledge is acquired through experience, which we call philosophical empiricism. Although few modern psychologists would tell you that nativism or empiricism are entirely correct, the issue of just how much nature and nurture explain any given human behavior is still very much a matter of study and debate. The story of psychology continues in 17th century France, where René Descartes, trying to understand how the inner world of subjective experience and the external physical world are linked, argued that body and mind are fundamentally different things. Descartes suggested that the mind influenced the body through the pineal gland, which is a tiny pinecone-shaped structure near the thalamus. This theory, called dualism, was challenged by Descartes' contemporaries. Thomas Hobbes argued that the mind and body aren't different things at all, and that the mind is what the brain does. More than 100 years later, other thinkers expanded this idea. Franz Joseph Gall thought that the brain and mind were linked, but by size rather than by any one gland. Gall examined the brains of people who had died and observed that mental ability often increased with brain size and conversely decreased with any damage to the brain. From this evidence, Gall theorized that specific abilities and characteristics were located in specific areas of the brain, and that these areas could be felt and mapped on the skull.
And this developed an idea called phrenology, which was serious at the time, and in some ways isn't 100% wrong, but was pushed so far that it now looks absurd. Imagined, in fact, with pictures of a skull with little pieces of human capacity, one after another, insightfulness and intuitiveness and compassion, that each human capacity was associated with a part of the brain.
Though perhaps a detour in the study of the mind and behavior, interest in the brain was growing. Other French scientists were beginning to link the brain and mind in a more convincing manner. Pierre Florenz and Paul Broca were the first to demonstrate, through surgical techniques and post-mortem examinations, that the mind is grounded in a material substance, namely the brain. Their work set the foundation for the scientific investigation of mental processes. By the mid-century, psychology was emerging as a unique and distinct field. Major contributions from two German scientists trained in the field of physiology, Hermann von Helmholtz and Wilhelm Wundt, led to the first ever psychology department at a university.
Structuralism was one of the early schools of psychology. One of the main players in it was a guy named Titchener. Titchener had been a student of Wilhelm Wundt. And the concern there was with the structure of mind. So it wasn't so much with what does the mind do, but what is the structure.
The goal of structuralism was to analyze the basic elements that constitute the mind by breaking consciousness down into elemental sensations and feelings. Structuralists sought to analyze these elements in a systematic way through introspection, where subjects would observe and record their raw sensory experience rather than the interpretation of it. For example, the observer presented with a sound might describe how loud it is, rather than identifying it as a buzzer or a bell. While structuralism had a deep influence on the development of psychology as a scientific discipline, skeptics eventually overtook the debate, chief among them a man named William James, who would go on to define a whole new school of thought. He disagreed with Wundt that consciousness could be broken down into its constituent parts, and instead argued that consciousness was more like a flowing stream, serving to adapt people to their environments. So instead of studying the mental structure, he studied mental function, the study of the purpose mental processes serve.
Functionalism refers to things people do, try to get done, functions in any functional explanation. You're imagining that there's something that could be carried out, and you're asking questions about how and how well it gets carried out.
Himself deeply influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, William James applied the evolutionary perspective to psychology, arguing that mental abilities must have evolved because they were adaptive.
In the late 1800s, Sigmund Freud arrives on the scene in Europe, and Freud has his own ideas about mental illness, about the origins of mental illness.
Freud developed the psychoanalytic perspective, an approach that focuses on the importance of the unconscious in shaping feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. To Freud, the unconscious was a dynamic, active system encompassing hidden memories, our deepest instincts and desires, and the internal struggle to control these forces. Freud's influence ran deep, but his ideas have been significantly diminished over the past 40 years. For one, his view of human nature was a dark one. His ideas were hard to test, and eventually a new school of thought emerged, the humanistic psychologists, with more of an emphasis on the positive potential of human beings. Freud's ideas continue to bear significance for modern research, but testability has been the crucial necessity for all psychological researchers since Freud's era. Influenced by the classic work of Ivan Pavlov, whose famous dog experiments established the concepts of classical conditioning, John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner were the champions of a school of thought dubbed Behaviorism. It was concerned with empirical studies of how animals learn and adapt based solely on observing their outer behavior. Behaviorism did allow psychologists to measure, predict, and control behavior to an extent, but it did this by ignoring some important things: the evolutionary history of the animal at hand, and the inner mental processes that thinkers such as James and Wundt had been so fascinated by. And so behaviorism faded to an approach that took these challenges head-on. This was cognitive psychology, rising to prominence through the 1950s and 60s. Cognitive psychology is the study of mental processes, including perception, memory, and reasoning. The shapers of this revolution were psychologists Wertheimer, Broadbent, and Neisser, and linguist Noam Chomsky.
Chomsky looked at the development in the life course of language and observed that things are happening so quickly that they're inexplicable unless you imagine that language is kind of wired in by evolution.
Inspired by the attempts of Carl Lashley, a former student of John B. Watson, to surgically study a rat brain and locate a site of learning, the cognitive psychologists would spawn the cognitive neuroscientists who, using new methods of brain imaging, would be the first to study the link between cognitive processes and brain activity. Today, psychology covers a vast range of territory. Evolutionary psychologists such as John Garcia and biologists like E.O. Wilson have played a large role in studying behavior from the perspective of millions of years of evolution that has shaped it. Social psychologists study interpersonal behavior. Solomon Asch, Kurt Lewin, Gordon Allport, important thinkers who studied the pressures and influences on the brain from the perspective of its place in a complex society.
Psychology is the marriage of our oldest questions, who are we and what are we here for, with our newest way of getting answers, science.
It's a field that has not gotten smaller, it's gotten bigger, and there have been more and more connections made with other fields, with different areas of biology in particular.
It promises to reveal exciting truths about human behavior, about human beings, about the mind and about the heart, about how we interact with each other and who we are between our ears.
No matter what your approach, the desire to understand the mysteries of human behavior is the common pursuit of psychology.